Hello, everybody. A Doll's House is going to be the topic of this video, and this video will go alongside my other videos about A Doll's House in my playlist on my channel, so check those out if you want more videos about the play. I'm going to be talking specifically in this video seminar about themes and the social and historical context of the play, and the intended audience for this video is A-level students. So the information is pitched at kind of an A-level standard. Okay, so the first thing we can say about A Doll's House in terms of context and themes is the fact that it is a play which is, or a text, which is evidence of the political and social protest genre. And that's why it has been included on the AQA specification for students studying that module. So this is just kind of a broad introduction, but I'm going to be talking about naturalism a bit later and what that is. But writers such as Ibsen at the time, and still now, I suppose, sometimes will choose their work to be some kind of protest against something. So a lot of political and social protest texts know that a certain injustice exists in the world. And by writing about that injustice with perhaps fictitious characters, the writer is aiming to push that injustice into the public agenda. In so doing, the belief is that that injustice will eventually be eradicated because a light has been shone on it, and that has varying degree of success. But Ibsen, of course, himself said, and I've mentioned this several times in my videos, a woman cannot be herself in modern society. So clearly, this play is an example of a feminist text, or a text which has a feminist agenda, even though Ibsen, of course, was male. So men can also be feminists as well. The play forces us to take a closer look at something, and in this case, it is the situation of women in 19th century Europe, more specifically Scandinavia, and the relationship that women have with marriage and the relationship that women have with a wider society. So that is essentially what the play is. It's about re-examining what it was to be female and also specifically a married mother at the time in the 19th century. So clearly this text is a protest against the treatment of women by society more broadly through the entrapping and claustrophobic force and restrictive force of marriage, but also that's represented through Helmer's characterization as this flawed kind of male figure in the house as well. So yes, this text is an example of political and social protest writing. Something else to think about in this play is the use of clothing. So, as is the case today, clothing is often a symbol of wealth and class because, you know, if you can afford nicer clothing, you're going to often show that off. So, Rank and Helmer, when this play is performed, are wearing good quality clothing, which shows their wealth and their status. But Krogstad and Mrs. Lind, for example, or Mrs. Linde as she is sometimes pronounced, their clothing represents a degree of harshness because both of those characters, of course, are at the moment, or at least at the beginning of the play, on the lower rung of the social ladder, and they're trying to reclaim their respectability or reclaim some form of independence. So their clothing shows that they have lived a relatively harsh life in recent times. Nora, of course, has her tarantella dress, which is a metaphor or a symbol of fantasy and illusion. The idea that dolls get dressed up in the same way that you would dress up Nora for this party and this dance that she's doing. But at the end, if you look at the stage directions closely, it says that she changes. She changes out of this very kind of showy and glitzy tarantella dress, and she changes into street clothes. And that, of course, is showing visually the fact that she is transitioning between two different states. She's transitioning from the role of a housewife who is performing, quite literally, to a housewife who is going back into something more solemn and real. And that's why she changes into her regular street clothes. So at the end, when she leaves the house, she is wearing her everyday clothes. Um, and that represents the change in her character as the play has developed. So look at clothing. Clothing can also be a dramatic method in terms of how directors and stage craft shows um, a character's own state of mind. So I'm going to be looking at 6 kind of aspects of social and historical context. It's important to remember whenever we talk about kind of SHC that we are not writing a history essay here. So the social historical context has to be a mode of interpretation. The idea being in English literature that students are using context as an interpretive tool in the same way that would use language as an interpretive tool. It's designed not to be the focus of the essay, but a tool in the student's smorgasbord, which they can use to understand meaning. So don't focus on social historical context for the whole essay, but it might be relevant if you are analysing something or discussing something in relation to a particular task. So we're going to start by talking about class and the new woman. So, at the time when this play was written, Norway and Europe, I suppose, more broadly, was turning into a capitalist economy from broad and quite rapid industrialization. And that created defined social groups. So, you had the working class, which might include Anne Marie, for example. You then had the expanding middle class by Mrs. Lind and Krogstad. And their desire to find work to build a sense of class and respectability. And then you have representatives of the upper class or the bourgeoisie shown through Helmer and also Dr. Rank. So that industrialization created very distinct social roles and social classes. And Krogstad's motivations, as is the case with Mrs. Lind to some extent, is to rise from a kind of a destroyed reputation or a hard life and try and find work and money from that work, which is going to reclaim your social respectability. Helmer, of course, would like to think that he has a lot of respectability because of his status. And Krogstad's motivation is to be the same as Helmer. But of course, Helmer, because of the conflict between those two men, that isn't necessarily going to happen. So you could get a question, hypothetically, about the idea that the play is essentially concerned with characters on a mission, on a quest to try and better themselves. It seems that all characters, to some extent, are concerned with that. This play, in more kind of focusing on perhaps Nora, is a good play to use if you wanted to talk about the new woman. So at this time, the first groups or the first sets of women were going to university. They were beginning to enter higher education. But middle class women gave up work if they married, and Nora, of course, is an example of this. Although secretly she is working, of course, in order to pay back the loan. So she's still trying to reclaim some independence, um, even though society would have said, actually, now you're married, your main duty, your main work is the nurturer and the housekeeper, or the homemaker, as they might say in America, rather than being being employed yourself. Women who were working, for example, in factories, so kind of lowly paid work, were poorly paid. And from a man's perspective, a man's social status was enhanced by having a housewife at home. And that actually carried through right into the 20th century, really. There's a sitcom called The Good Life from the 70s. And there's a character in it called Margot Ledbetter, who doesn't have a job. She's an executive's wife. And her husband, Jerry, is some kind of high flyer, kind of in the city, I imagine. But he would often bring his male colleagues up to their home in suburbia. And almost it would be Margot's job to, cook and make the house look good and socialize and be the hostess. So we had that right up until kind of even recent times. So Helmer likes the fact that he has a wife at home because it is linked to his own uh, kind of respectability and how he is perceived by other men. At the end, by leaving the house, she's also leaving the marriage and she's rejecting her wife and mother role, dissenting from the social sphere that society said women should have. So at this time, men and women occupied completely separate spheres in society. So men were occupying the high flying world of business and finance, whereas women were the nurturers at home, children in the house, for example. So those two spheres didn't exist. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't communicate. They didn't exist in a kind of in like a Venn diagram. They didn't really meet very much in the middle. Um, and what Nora is doing, and what Ibsen is getting Nora to do, is to challenge that very binary approach to the roles of men and women in society. Nora does that by leaving, but she also does that by working in secret. And that's why she says it was almost like being a man when she was earning money in secret by doing copying work. She likes it because it means that she's reclaiming that independence and she's conflating that binary between these two separate spheres. So the new woman is a woman which is, I suppose, daring enough or rebellious enough to challenge those two separate spheres of kind of societal roles. In terms of idealism and naturalism, so they tend to be opposites. So what Ibsen is doing in this play is he's rejecting idealism, which up to this point had shaped a lot of the arts. The idea being that truth and beauty were the prerogative and what was foregrounded. And what Ibsen is actually saying is, no, I want to actually show truth. I want to show how things really are. And that's why realism and naturalism are foregrounded in this play. And I've got some bullet points there as to why we would call this a naturalist drama or a naturalist prose drama, because it's using relatable and realistic locations that an audience would be able to understand. You know, it's a family home, which the majority of the audience would have themselves. The critic Eric Boe or Boch said the play is so simple it's in its action and so everyday in its dress, meaning that Ibsen is not trying to represent something on stage here which is otherworldly. This is real, and that's why potentially the play was so controversial when it first came out, because audiences understood exactly what was going on because they could relate to it. So it's an exploration of real people and real environments. Kind of human behaviour is understandable because it's explained within its context. So the kind of the gender politics, the situation regarding marriage, for example, and it's a rejection, therefore, of sentimentalism or idealism. This is not kind of frilly, happy ending, arguably kind of sentimental stuff depicting beauty. It's actually kind of depicting kind of how things really are. Okay, so that's the important thing here. There's also a degree of moral sickness. So a semantic field in this play is to do with this idea of decay or decomposition or illness. And that is a metaphor for this idea of morality and moral sickness. So Dr. Rank and Helmer are constantly lecturing others about the importance of morality because moral sickness equals lies and secrets. And therefore, such behaviour corrupts the happy atmosphere of the home. And that links to what Helmer says at the end of Act 1 when he lectures Nora about how people, usually women, he says, that invite their children into their lies and deceit corrupts the children and also corrupts the happy atmosphere of the home. As a result of that, there is this kind of ongoing web of lies, and Nora then separates herself from the children and doesn't want anything else to do with them, really, as a way of protecting them. So that's moral sickness. Can I just draw your attention back to rejection of idealism? I actually made an error on the second bullet point. Instead of saying truth and beauty, it should say artifice and beauty. Okay, so this play is very much concerned with showing truth. So sorry about that. Moving on to conformism. This is to do with Helmer. So Helmer conforms, but he doesn't challenge. He's very much a man who exists within clear rules and guidelines which are operating in society. So working as a bank manager and lawyer, of course, there's lots of regulation and there's lots of rules with that. and he likes those rules because it gives him clear boundaries. But he doesn't have the nature to question those rules. So at the end, when Nora is discussing how religion and society and the law must be wrong, Helmer doesn't really see it. He doesn't say, "Oh, it must be then," or "Yes, you're right to challenge it." It goes against those clear and definite laws that he has lived by. Um, of course, there is a time um, when sometimes things don't have an easy answer. So, as a lawyer, of course, he knows very clearly the difference between right and wrong. But sometimes things happen that blurs that. Things aren't always black and white. So, usually the philosophical question is it right for a parent to steal a loaf of bread for their starving family? Some people would say absolutely it is, and I think perhaps, although I wouldn't maybe get you to try it, but perhaps the police and others would take quite a lenient view if it was established that the reason why you were stealing that bread was to feed children. Um, so Helmer is a conformist. He isn't a challenger. He's not really a rebel in that sense, because he operates within these clear, defined rules. And of course, Nora doesn't. Nora is challenging those clear and defined rules. Finally, in terms of historical and social context, this play is an example of a well-made play because of its structure. It's consistent with a structure which was proposed by dramatist Eugene Scribe. It has an exposition where it sets up the plot and characters. It has a development which it reveals some kind of problem or details, in this case, of the loan and the extent of Nora's deceit and situation. The complication could be regarded as Krogstad's blackmail and the letter business in the beginning of Act 3, the end of Act 2, and Nora's lack of options. And it has resolution, the ending, which is Nora's exit and Mrs. Lind and Krogstad becoming an item. So those kind of subheadings show that this play is consistent with Scribe's idea of a well-made play. Sometimes it's represented in like a line graph, a plot line graph, where the middle of the graph looks like a bit like a pyramid. It goes up and then down towards the end. So we can also call A Doll's House an example of a well-made play. Okay, so hopefully that was useful. Some information there regarding the social and historical context of A Doll's House, aimed at students studying the text as part of their A-level in English literature. Thank you very much for watching, and good luck in your studies.